I'm from Cullybegy, Ballymena, okay? But the point about that is, this whole apologetics thing, you do not have to be smart. You don't have to be an intellectual. You don't have to be a professor. You know, if you want to know this, if you're passionate about defending the faith, if you're passionate about spreading the name of Jesus to your friends or whoever, you can know this stuff, and I'm proof of it. The other thing, even before we get to the slides, is this verse has come up. It came up today in church. I talked about it last day in church. I'm sure you know that. If you talk about apologetics, there's the verse in the Bible where the word comes from, 1 Peter 3:15. I'm sure you've maybe talked about it here, have you? Honor Christ. But in your hearts, it says, honor Christ the Lord as holy. And then it tells us how. How do we honor Christ? If you're a Christian in here now, you want to go out into the world and you want to honor him. Peter tells us, always be prepared. Always prepare yourself. The reason this came up so much was Charlie Kirk. If you followed that whole thing, Charlie Kirk was an apologist. Yeah, he was into all the other stuff and the politics and all that there, but Charlie Kirk was an evangelist and he was an apologist, and he had a good answer for everybody that asked. So this is why it came up. Charlie Kirk honored Christ the Lord as holy. He was always prepared to make a defense. This is the apologetics that we're going to talk about. He always had a reason, a defense for his faith to anyone who asks you for a reason. So you want to honor Christ the Lord as holy tomorrow at school with your friends? This verse tells you, be prepared to give an answer, and that's why your leaders want you to be prepared. They want you to honor Christ. God doesn't want somebody to ask you, why are you a believer? And you say, I have no idea. That doesn't honor Christ. And then the final thing, do it with gentleness and respect. So tonight then, it's the moral argument. Big button. Hey. So that's roughly what we're going to go through. If you that might why are you laughing? I spent a lot of time in this. So roughly, if you see, once you get to see that guy's wee face, you know that we're nearly over. All right. Why the moral argument? So let me give. So this is groups of three. The first one is, why the moral argument? Why is that a good argument? I was going to say at the start of this is maybe my favourite argument. I don't know if it's my favourite, but it's probably the one that I think about every day. It's probably the one that I find the most interesting. I like to go on and watch debates about people. It's the one I like to see people debating, you know, whether it's an atheist or an agnostic or something, because it's the one that I find people squirm. They don't need, you know, on the other side, they don't seem to have a good answer for it. But one reason I think you should know this, and it might be hard to learn, but it's one that you should know, and the first reason I'm going to say is, everyone, every day, experiences it. So it's the thing when you turn on the TV, everybody's having arguments about what's right and what's wrong. It's the one when you're having a conversation with your friends, all the time there's this thing comes up about what you should and shouldn't do. So that's the first thing, but why it's a good argument is because you can use it every day. It's happening all over the place. Second one, I'll get into all this at the end. It's foundational for all the rest of your apologetics. It's going to help you answer other questions, and we'll think about that later. And then the last one, because this one gets you to the gospel. This one is part of the gospel. Again, we'll go to that at the end. It was good that Andrew went through the cosmological last week. Here's a famous quote that I had in this slide before I knew that he was going to do that or whatever. This guy says, this famous philosopher says, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them. So something filled this guy with awe. This guy wrestled with all these things about God and all, and he says these two things, the starry heavens above me, that was last week, cosmological. He looks up at the stars and he contemplates, where did it all come from? And then he looks at this moral law within, He says, there's this thing inside me that I know right and wrong. And he says, where does it come from? And here is, where does this law, this thing that you have inside of you, let's say murder of an innocent person is wrong. Where does that come from? The Bible tells us, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, they don't have the Old Testament, that's us, going back all the years back into Jesus' time, the Jews had the law, the Gentiles didn't. But by nature, they do what the law requires. They are a law to themselves, even though they don't have a law. They show that the work of the law is written on our hearts, while their conscience, this thing called a conscience that tells you what's right and wrong, bears witness. Okay? So the Bible tells us every man born on this earth has this inbuilt sense of right and wrong. And even though they haven't got this law, they maybe don't have a Bible, everybody knows basically that there's a right and there's a wrong. What am I doing wrong now? Is Brian the best you can get here, is he, or what? So, a few things just to say. This is all, has a big, long introduction here. Preliminaries. So, sometimes this gets mixed up, like, what is the moral law, and you explain it, and some people would say, you're saying I need God, or I have to believe in God to be a good person, or you're saying Christians are better people than non-Christians, so don't get that in your head. This has nothing to do about how people act. It's not trying to say that you need to believe in God to be a good person. There's good people, or relatively speaking, good people on both sides. The other one is this idea of objective. I was trying to think of a different way to put it that's easy for kids to understand, but I can't really get away with this thing, this objective. So we're going to, before we even get to the argument, we're going to think of these objective moral values. So what we're trying to say here is, like, true, independent of human opinion. So when we say objective, we're saying these things, you shall not murder someone. Murder is wrong. That's true even if every human being didn't believe it. As opposed to something subjective, which is dependent on you. So that's like, I like Maud's honeycomb, Hannah likes chocolate. That's just subjective opinion. There's no right or wrong. What we're saying about these moral laws is that they're objective. No humans existed, murder would still be wrong. How do I go back? Okay, here's the first flaw. I haven't got the argument here. All right, let me go back. You seen the wee guy there, but it's not over. All right, I have actually missed a slide. So let me just try and say it out loud. See if you can clear this. If you're taking notes, then it's objective moral values exist. That's the first one we're going to say. We're going to say objective moral values or duties exist. So right and wrong really exists. The second point would be nature, natural realm. Nature cannot explain these objective moral values. And then the conclusion is, therefore, it must be a supernatural explanation. Okay, it has to be supernatural. If it's not natural, it's supernatural. So, 3 reasons to explain that objective moral values exist. Here's the first one: evidence from lived experience. So this is just the idea that everybody just knows. Everybody has this inbuilt sense, like we've seen in Romans. Everybody just seems to know, yeah, murder is clearly wrong. Stealing from a charity is clearly wrong. I was trying to think how to do this argument, and the book, if you want a book to read about this, is just come back to the classic Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I'm sure you've heard about that talked about in here. So the first part of that book, maybe the first third of that book, is talking about this moral argument. And he says this is how he starts the book. He says, people say things like this. How would you like it if anyone did the same to you? Or, that's my seat, I was there first. Or, leave him alone, he isn't doing you any harm. Or, why should you shove in first? Or, give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine. Or, come on, you promised. The man who says these things is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. So Lewis says somewhere else, he says, there's many things out there I don't know, but he says, the only thing I know for sure is what's inside of me. And he says, when I look inside of me, I just have this knowledge that murder is wrong or whatever. And he's saying, that's what I'm trying to say, but everybody in everyday life has this assumption. You need to be kind, you need to be good, you need to share. So it's part of everyday experience. Evidence from common experience. So not only does everybody seem to know, or not only do I look inside me and know, it looks like when you look at all time, all cultures, certain moral values are universal. Everybody believes them. One guy says, he found 4. He says, every culture, yeah, there may be differences. Every culture believes in sympathy, fairness, self-control, duty. Go back to C.S. Lewis. He's in our book, The Abolition of Man, is an appendix at the back of him. He goes through the history of all the cultures. He calls it this Tao. He says they all have these certain values that they all agree upon. Yeah, they might act out slightly differently. They might disobey certain things. They might have their conscience seared in certain things. But there's this standard that everybody seems to share. And here's the next one. The last one. How do we know objective moral values exist? Evidence from the absurdity of denying it. So the evidence from it would be absurd to say that there was no objective moral values. So, for example, if there were no objective moral values, if there was no moral law outside of us, we would have to say things like the Nazis were not wrong. They weren't objectively wrong. We might not like it, but they might not like the way we live. So the Nazis were not wrong. Love is no better than hate. There are no human rights. Another guy wrote a book, not a believer, he says, he agrees with us. He says, cut a human open, you will not find human rights. Human rights are just in the stories that we tell. Murder, slavery, racism are not wrong. Religious people have never done anything wrong, so you hear that all the time. You religious people do this and that. Yeah, but if there's no objective moral values, what do you mean by wrong? Tolerance is no better than intolerance, and there is no problem of evil. So if objective moral values do not exist, if they're not objective, they're not outside of us, that's what you would have to believe. So that's the first one. Objective moral values. Oh, there's there. Objective moral values exist. So that's the first premise, if you want. Second one, nature cannot explain objective moral values. So it's hard to imagine how could this objective moral value exist. Murder is wrong. How could that exist within our natural realm? Where would they come from? So let me give you 3 common responses. 3 reasons why a non-believer, a non-theist, or a non-Christian would say these objective moral values come from. First one, evolution. A lot of people say we just evolved a certain way. Certain groups, let's say these group of apes evolved because they had this mutation within them and they started to look after their own group and they survived more than the groups that were maybe aggressive to each other. So they would say, yeah, so that evolved and natural selection selected them. So therefore, that's what we believe to be moral. So they would say evolution explains or morals. So I've wrote here, the problem of evolution grounding, so that's just a fancy way of saying the problem of trying to make evolution the grounds or the reason for your objective moral values. Here's 3 problems at least. Evolution is about change, isn't it? It's about one thing becoming another. So then your morals change too. So if evolution gave us our morals, then why not just say we just evolved from slavery being fine? Well, yeah, we evolved out of that. But then you would have to say, but it was okay then, because at that stage, that's what all the humans believed. Are you willing to take that burden? Evolution is about survival, not truth. So that's the other big thing. If you've ever heard this, you can get an is, but not an ought from evolution. Evolution just tells you the way things are. It just tells you what happened, but it doesn't tell you the way things should be. On evolution, everything just happens. And then the last one. If evolution is true and there is no God, well, everything you do comes from evolution. So the desire to be at peace with everybody, if that comes from evolution, so does the desire to go to war with everybody. Every desire you have comes from evolution. So then what is it, when you've got that desire to fight or that desire to have peace, what is it that tells you which desire to choose? It has to be something outside your desires. I think you look very confused. Does that make sense? All right, good. So it seems like then evolution can't really explain objective moral values. It can't tell you why you should do something, why something's right or wrong. The second explanation people would give, oh, there's a wee quote. Evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. So this is an evolutionary biologist, not a Christian, but he's just going to tell us straight. Evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear there are no ultimate foundation for ethics. He agrees with us. The problem of societal grounding, again, sounds a fancy way to say it's just what society tells you. We get our objective moral values depending on what our government, what our society kind of agrees is the case. 3 problems with that. The problem of condemnation. Everything goes back to the Nazis. So this is like saying, well, sure, in Nazi Germany, most of the population thought it was okay to exterminate the Jews. Therefore, if that's what society says is right, well, let's just go with that then. Is that what you want to agree with? That doesn't make sense. It can't be what just society believes. The problem with moral reformers. Let's go to America and their slavery. And Martin Luther King tried to abolish slavery. He was a moral reformer. He tried to reform the morals of the nation. But he was going against what the nation believed. He was going against what everybody believed at the time. But if it's society determines what we believe, then Martin Luther King was wrong. And again, like evolution, the problem of moral change. If society's beliefs change, then your morality changes, then it's not objective. And then the last one, we'll not spend much time again. The problem of just so grounding. Some people just say, they just exist. And your first response, if anybody ever said that, would be, well, okay, then God just exists. But it's hard to imagine how things can just exist, because where would they be? Where would these things exist? It's hard to think they exist without a person given them. It's hard to understand how they would exist if you're most atheists would be what we call materialists. They just believe that everything that exists is just stuff, hard stuff that you can touch, stuff that you can look through a microscope. If that's the case, if you're a materialist, well, where would these laws be? Here's another famous guy. I haven't put the thing on it. He says this. To say that something is wrong because it is forbidden by God is perfectly understandable to anyone who believes in a law-giving God. So it makes sense for us. He says, but to say that something is wrong, even though no God exists to forbid it, he says that's not understandable. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. So he's just saying what we're trying to say here tonight. If there's no God, there is no moral virtues, there's no moral obligations, there's no moral values. Does it make sense? So, objective moral values seem to exist. Nature can't explain moral values. Here's one more quote. Nietzsche. When one gives up Christian belief, one thereby deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. For the latter is not self-evident. Christianity is a system. So again, this guy Nietzsche, not a Christian, but he's saying, and if you read more about him, he's saying, yeah, all that good stuff in society, all that compassion for the weak, comes with the whole system of Christianity. And if you don't have that, you've got no reason to believe in these objective morals. Well, there's the argument. Objective moral values exist. Nature cannot explain objective moral values. Therefore, objective moral values have a supernatural explanation. Why the moral argument? Just to repeat, we talk about it all the time. It's on your TV screens every night. Everybody thinks, every argument, everybody thinks there's this thing, these rules that everybody has to apply to, has to obey. So your question then to these people would be, well, where does those rules come from? Why am I obligated to obey those rules? Who says? By what standard? Foundation for apologetics. If you were going really deep, you would say because even truth is a moral virtue. You would say even to start talking about truth, you need to think, well, is truth the right thing? Is it the right thing to know truth? But even on a more practical level, you think of the problem of evil, problem of suffering that people all bring up to Christians. Why do bad things happen if there's a good God and an all-powerful God? And your first response should probably be, or one response would be, and this was C.S. Lewis's argument. This is one of the reasons C.S. Lewis became a Christian at the time. He says, I looked out at the world and I seen all the suffering and I was indignant. It didn't seem right. And then he says, but where did I get this idea of right and wrong? Why am I judging the way the world works? What is it that gives me that sense of right and wrong, that sense of injustice in the world? And then he realized it can only be God. That's the problem of evil and the problem of the Old Testament, some of the Old Testament stuff that you read and you struggle to understand. Why would God do that? And people will bring that objection to you. How can you believe in a God that would wipe out the Canaanites? But again, this moral thing makes you think, but why do you think that's wrong? Where are you getting your standard from to judge that as wrong? And then it gets to the gospel. This is C.S. Lewis again, so if you read his Mere Christianity, you get to the end, he says, the reason that I started my book with this moral argument is because the problem back then, and probably the problem today, is nobody believes that they're a sinner. Nobody believes in the bad news to get to the good news. And he wanted to show everybody, listen, you know there's a moral law. You know there's a standard by which you and everybody else in society needs to obey. So he was appealing to this common ground with everybody. You know there's a standard. And he also says, and you know that you don't meet that standard. So it's a good way then to get to the gospel. Last thing then. When I was getting ready for this, and I Googled it, the moral argument, the BBC bite size. Sure nobody works for the BBC in here? Okay. BBC are bad. This was unbelievable, because I don't think I'm being biased. I think I think people that have thought this through, and atheists and agnostics, and you go into them debates, a lot of people would admit, yeah, that is a good argument, and I have no real good answer for it. But when you go into BBC Bite Size, and this is for the kids, isn't it? I'm pretty sure BBC Bite Size is trying to target you guys. And you go, it gives you this strength of the argument. It gives you one strength, and it's pretty garbage when you read it. I'll not get into it. And it gives you 5 weaknesses of the argument. So what I want to do now is, I did think about putting these in groups, and you could answer it yourselves. The thing says nobody wants to do that. So I'll read it through, and I'll give you 10 seconds to think. You think for yourself then, out of everything that I have said there, how would you answer this? Because these are the sort of questions that, as you can see, people are trying to put out there. Can you read that? Yeah? So, you think for 10 seconds. Somebody says this to you. I reject this argument because morality is a social convention learned through experience and upbringing. You think about that. Somebody says, I know, but your morals just come through what you've been taught by society. That should be an easy one because we talked about that. We say, okay, but if they're from society, if it's what society teaches, well, this is the problem of the Nazis again. Well, what society starts to teach, what? It's okay to hang the Jews again. Do we just go what society teaches us? Well, obviously that can't be right. So that one's pinned. That's nonsense. The evidence against a universal moral code is that some people, for example, a murderer or rapist, has no sense of morality. Therefore, there's no sense in which all people have a common moral code. What would you say to that? What about the murderers and the rapists? They don't seem to have a sense of morality. Yet you're telling me it's common. You're telling me Romans says everybody has it. What would you say to that? Think about that. I would say most murderers and rapists know that they're doing wrong, surely. Unless you're a psychopath, which is a different thing. Everybody knows it's wrong. Furthermore, in some parts of the world, bribery and corruption are acceptable, while in other parts of the world it is not, which suggests there's no common agreement on what is or is not morally acceptable. So there's some countries that do bribery and corruption. I'd say the same thing then. They know it's wrong. There are many alternative explanations for morality that have nothing to do with God. For example, conscience might be entirely a product of the brain. If conscience is the voice of God, then why are there differences of opinion about issues such as abortion and euthanasia? What would you say to that? There's differences of opinions. Does that mean there's no moral law? Surely when you get into a debate with somebody about abortion, surely they're trying to tell you that I should be compassionate to the woman, and we're trying to tell them, no, you need to be compassionate to the child. But aren't we all appealing to some objective moral law? Isn't there something above what we both think that we're trying to get the other person to believe in? We believe in compassion, that's the common thing, and we're trying to get each other to believe. So we agree. We agree there's an objective moral value. Not everyone believes in God, yet atheists and agnostics seem to understand the difference between right and wrong and to live good lives. What would you say to that? So again, this is what we said at the start, the argument we're not making. We're not saying that atheists and agnostics don't understand the difference between right and wrong. In fact, our argument is they do. Our argument is, our Bible tells us, expect that. Expect everybody to know the difference between right and wrong. Last one, the moral argument might suggest the existence of some sort of lawgiver, but it cannot prove the existence of God as traditionally understood. What would you say to that? I would say if you can convince somebody that there's a lawgiver, that would be okay. Because then, well, what is it? Maybe that's what you see. Andrew talked last week about putting a stone in somebody's shoe, just making somebody uncomfortable, giving them a question. If all you can convince somebody is that there's a lawgiver, that might be enough. That's really all the argument is saying. There is a being out there. There is something out there that has written this moral law. and everybody believes it. I think you've got them part of the way there, have you not? That's what all these arguments are doing. The cosmological will not get you to believe in the resurrection, but it's part of a cumulative case for Christianity. And I think if you get something to the lawgiver, you've done a good job. I think that's me. Any questions? And Caroline will answer. No? All right. All right. Close in a word of prayer then. All right. Father, we thank you again, as this quote said, for the starry skies above and the moral law within, Lord, that you have written your name, you have written your presence, Lord, everywhere, within and without, Lord. And I pray, Lord, that you will equip the people in here, the young people in here, Lord, to be prepared, to honour Christ as holy, Lord, as they go about their business, as they go about their schools, Lord, that they can know that within themselves, Lord, they can be sure of the foundations of their faith, Lord, and they can be persuasive. They can answer the questions of their friends, Lord, and bring them to faith. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.